So let me just start with the very beginning. My name is Paul Hamill. I'm a graduate of Emmanuel Missionary College, and also I have a master's degree and a doctorate degree in music. But let me start at the very beginning. I was born in Kintyre, North Dakota in August 8, 1919. But when I was still a baby, my parents moved to Wisconsin, where I lived primarily all my life. I went to public school for 4 years and then to church school. My family moved to Arpin, Wisconsin, which had near it Bethel Academy and a church school. So from grades 5 through high school, I was in Adventist schools. Then in 1937, I came here as a freshman. And I finished an education, that is an elementary education program, and I taught church school my first year out at a town called Beloit, Wisconsin. And from there, after a year of teaching, I was drafted into the Army as a member of the Armed Forces for World War II. This happened in the autumn of that year, and I went to Camp Grant for basic training, and I was educated there to be a first aid man on the battlefield. But it was not long after that I finished basic training, and they kept me on as a drill instructor at Camp Grant in what they call the tent city. I had a platoon of soldiers which I was training. And when the winter came, we moved to North Carolina, not far from Asheville, North Carolina, where there was a brand new general hospital just opening up. And I was somewhat educated in the medical lines. I worked part-time in the hospital while I was going to school. So I knew something about the medical institutions and how they ran. So I mentioned this to the placement officer when I went at Camp Grant and also at Fort Sheridan, and they assigned me to a medical unit, not because I was 1AO, because I wasn't. I was just plain 1A, listed as a combat soldier. But I don't know what happened, but when I moved to this new hospital, I guess there were openings in the non-commissioned ranks. And I did not know the person who assigned me, but I was raised from a private to a sergeant when we got to this new hospital in North Carolina near Asheville. And I had some good friends in Asheville. I went to church every Sabbath, nearly every Sabbath I go to church. I had an apartment in Asheville. I lived with my wife. It's like it wasn't an 8 to 5 job. It's more like 7 to 9 or something, depending. But anyway, I was probably shipped to different military units 4 or 5 times. And it seemed like most of the time I arrived on Friday, and next day was Sabbath, which right away made a problem. Because here you are, a new recruit, a new soldier. I said, can I have tomorrow off? And they said, hey, this is a wartime. You cannot have tomorrow off. So I didn't know what to do. And I knew this time I was in Illinois, one of those times. So I called the man who was tutelage, he was titled as assisting soldiers in problems. So I called him in Wisconsin, and he couldn't help me. I went to our local chaplain. He said, well, this is wartime, too bad. Anyway, so I went back to my commanding officer, who was a captain. He said, well, okay, I'll give you tomorrow off, but stay within this little compound. A company that had 3 or 4 barracks. Stay within this area, and you can just loaf around here. And doing that, I met 2 other Adventist soldiers who were also in the same conditions I was. So we just hung around there. And finally, one of my officers said, well, Hamel, you really should not be here. You should be in one of those camps for conscientious objectors. I said, I'm not an objector. I just like to have my Saturdays off, and I'm glad to do medical work anytime. So they kept me on, and then I relayed my experiences from then on. But it did seem that very often I had to make my quick arrangements for a Sabbath arrangement. And in general, they treated us well. Only at one time was I threatened to be sent to a camp for objectors. And while I was in England, I visited the church in Shrewsbury, Adventist church, which was above a fish and chip joint. they call it. Noisy and smelly, but there was our church upstairs. Maybe about 25 or 30 members. And I think of interest is that after I left, they assigned a new pastor to that church. And he is the father-in-law of one of my sons, now living in Chattanooga. He came to America with his family after the war. He was a pastor in the churches. And his daughter is the wife of my son, Lauren. Oh, you know, I forgot what his name is, but he lives in Collegedale now. He's a house there. And interesting, I've forgotten his name, but he's a very nice pastor, and he's now retired, but he was active in this country for several years as a pastor. So that was kind of interesting to me that I'd have a daughter-in-law who was a daughter of the pastor of the church where I went when I was a soldier. So since I had some experience in medical lines, they assigned me to a hospital, or at least, yes, to a hospital. And I was in Memorial General Hospital for about a year and a half. And while I was there, I had an interesting experience. I used to I lived in Asheville with my wife. We drove every morning about 15 miles to the hospital. And I rode with a couple of medical doctors, one of whom was a graduate of Loma Linda University. Then I was called College of Medical Evangelists. Anyway, they were talking about an incident at the hospital where an enlisted man's wife had the flu, and they asked for her to be admitted to the hospital as a patient, and they refused. But they did treat officers' dependents, and I learned later even dogs. An officer's dog was hit by a car, and they x-rayed it, but they refused admission to this. He was a corporal, and he died subsequently. And just by happenstance, I talked to a man. He turned out to be the mortician who took care of the body. So I had a conversation with him, and they confirmed that this person had asked for admission to the hospital, been denied, and died. There's a sort of a flu going around, which is fairly serious. So that upset me a whole lot, to think they're trying to cover it up and push it in the background. So I had an idea of writing to a columnist called, see, what was his name again? Anyway, he had a column in the newspaper and broadcast every night. So I wrote a letter to him detailing what had happened. And I had it witnessed by another soldier who signed it also. So that caused quite an uproar because he read my letter over the radio, the nationwide hookup. It's called the Washington Merry-Go-Round. And there Drew Pearson, by the way, was the gentleman behind all of that. So of course he mentioned Moore General Hospital about where this happened. And it aroused a lot of ire among the people of the United States. And so I thought that I would be incognito. But they finally found out who it was. So I was called in the office of the commanding officer, and he asked me if I had done this. I said, yes, I did it. And of course, he was Irish. He said, I'm getting letters from all over and phone calls condemning us for our action, and that never really happened. I said, well, sir, there's evidence that did happen, and we could go to the admission records and find out for sure if there's a denial there. He said, that's irrelevant. I said, sure, that is relevant. Anyway, he finally, I thought for sure, I was a sergeant at the time, and I thought for sure he would put me back as a private, but he didn't. And Drew Pearson said, if they discriminated against you in any way, let me know. And I can still raise plenty of ire here in Washington. And he could. He was a powerful, powerful man in his way, in his discourses in the newspaper, and every Sunday night he had his radio program. Anyway, he said, okay, sir, you can go back to your work, which I did. I was working in the surgical unit where they performed major operations on soldiers. Anyway, I thought, well, that's the end of it. But it didn't turn out to be that way. But my commanding officer says, no more of this. You're not going to write to anybody about this ever again. And anyway, I did write back to Drew Pearson said, because the commanding officer apparently gave the orders, from then on they made a whole ward for dependents of soldiers to care for their physical needs. So I wrote this to Drew Pearson, but I said, don't mention this on the radio because I don't want to be in more trouble here. But anyway, I was due for a furlough. You get 10 days a year off. So I went to my parents' place, and on a Sunday we were listening to the radio, and here he reads my letter on the radio. I said, oh, I'm in big trouble now. Anyway, I drove back, and I got back just minutes before my furlough was up, checked in. And here on the board was general orders. Sergeant Paul E. Hamill transferred to Camp Butner. I was sent to join a medical unit there. So I was out fast. And anyway, it was an interesting experience, and the story was even published in the Asheville newspaper, big double spread pictures, and quite a bit about the whole situation. So it did some good. But I don't think I suffered, but it was a little uncomfortable at times. But I was a hero among the enlisted personnel. The non-commissioned officers and the privates, I was a hero to them because things opened up. And you know, there was a severe flu epidemic in North Carolina when I was there as a soldier. A lot of people were very sick and hospitals were crowded, but they didn't have room and just said to this lady, I'm sorry, you can't admit her. And they wanted to admit her to a Ford German. We had plenty of empty beds, a lot of doctors, but they wouldn't admit her. They wouldn't admit her, and she died. So that's pretty serious. So I felt really good about it, but here I was transferred out. So I got to my new unit, and they said, you know, Sergeant Hamel, we have a problem with you. You're listed as a discontent, and if you don't want to go overseas with us, I'll arrange it so you can stay in this country. Because even the Fourth Service Command, whose headquarters was in Atlanta, had me listed as a discontented soldier. Anyway, I said, no, I'd rather go overseas. Because if you stay here, you'd be shipped hither and yon, and nobody wanted to keep you. So I said, I want to go overseas with you. So I did. And I was there with what they called the 137th General Hospital. We set up our headquarters. We were the first ones there after the invasion of Normandy, and we set things up and got going and got our first casualties pretty quick. So I was glad to be there, and I was assigned as I was a sergeant still, assigned me to be in charge of what they call central supply for the hospital. We had a big hospital, 4,000 beds. And with central supply, we collected the blood and the plasma and all medical supplies for all the wards. And they would come to us and check out what they needed to take care of their wards. And it was a good job, and I liked it. I liked doing it, but I knew that there was a contingent going overseas, so I had to go with them, which I did. There's a big troop ship. I think it was called the Aquitania. Anyway, our whole unit was assigned to the bottom level, below the waterline, and we were on the Atlantic Ocean, being transported. And just above us, they had these big watertight doors, and they said, the second we have a problem, those doors get closed. So I felt, man, we could drown like rats down here. If we had a torpedo come through that side, the doors will shut, and we're gone. So I spent as much time as I could topside. But I had my bunk down there, so I spent 8 hours. I think I shared a bunk with somebody else, which often you would do. Anyway, but as much as I could, I stayed above the waterline. Anyway, we survived. No problems. Although our ship was zigzag every few minutes, it changed direction, which was the right protocol for the captain to be involved in those maneuvers. Well, the reason they zigzagged every few moments was if there was a submarine or an enemy destroyer or battleship, they're more apt to not locate you good enough to send a shell or a torpedo your way, because by zigzagging, they hope to avoid just going straight and being a perfect target. And we landed in a little town called Ellesmere in England, where our hospital was. near a railhead, near an airport. So we received patients both by air and by rail. And it wasn't long until we were really full. And did a big business with plasma, whole blood. And every soldier, must have been several hundred soldiers at this hospital. And every soldier was required to give blood at least once a month to help survive. It was general, I think, probably over all the people in England. But most of the time we had plasma and still water. And we'd give them a box with plasma and a bottle of water in it. They'd take that box to the ward and mix the water with the plasma, which is powder. And then they would use that instead of whole blood. But we also had whole blood. We had a refrigerator in our department run by a little oil lamp. Somehow the heat from the lamp operated the freezing unit in the refrigerator, so we kept frozen. We put blood, whole blood would go in there waiting to be called for transfusions. But actually most soldiers who were wounded, once they got to us, they survived. We lost very few soldiers. Of course, they had first aid stand, and then they had company hospital, evacuation hospital, then they came to us. So they've been through several surgical and medical screenings before we got them. And those we got, in general, were saved. We lost a few, but not very many. Although we did send quite a few back. The $1 million wound was one that shipped you back. We call it the ZI, short for the Zone of Interior, which was the United States. But I'd like to give you one more interesting thing. One morning I went to breakfast at our dining hall, and across the table there was the husband of one of my wife's cousins. And he had been assigned, he was a mortician, and he'd been assigned to be a mortician on the hospital ship, or an attendant anyway. And he went back and forth across the ocean, but he was assigned for quarters and rations, they called it, to our hospital while he's waiting for the next ship to go back from England to America. So unusual circumstance. My wife's cousin's husband, a mortician, undertaker. Okay, so things happen. But I did have, in our unit, there was another Adventist young man. He worked in what they call a motor pool. He was kind of a mechanic, and he had some responsibilities to keep the ambulances and the jeeps and the staff cars oiled and greased and maintained. I've forgotten his name, but he was nice. I'm sure he's no longer with us. Also had another fellow who turned out to be he took law and he came back. And I did hear from him a time or two. And I also had a real good friend with whom I had a visit just a few years ago. He's passed away now. He was also assigned to the same department I was, and he was under me. And but we had a good relationship back and forth. And I met his wife afterwards, and he just passed away last year. And we had some British people who were some ladies and some older men who worked with us. And sometimes we had prisoners of war working under, we had guards around. But we had a lot of prisoners of war at our unit at certain times, and they put them to work. We had them in there, but then we also had recuperating American soldiers who would be signed while they were recuperating. They would work in central supply and make bandages, that sort of thing. We used to make what they call 4x4s. They call them sponges. They're gauze, and they're folded in certain ways, and you would fold them by hand. Well, I said, man, that's kind of arduous. So I devised a cardboard. I made it in squares, and by use of adhesive tape, you could put a sheet on here of gauze, and by flipping here and there, they made it all once here. They had it perfect. So, and also we used to use strips of gauze and make drains. They'd have abdominal surgery. They put gauze drains in, and we used to pull them by hand. But I devised with little nails and boards. You just pull it through, and as you pull it through, it folds it together, and you have it all made. before we do it. Luckily it did. So I was glad I got some of those things done. Yes, when I was in London there was bombing, but we were in a part of London where the bombs didn't fall in those nights when I was there. The Germans were interested mostly in bombing the east end of London, where it was commercial, and I was in the west end of London. So they were bombing, but it's quite peaceful where I was. But it had been bombed in that area. And I visited, of course, the main attractions in London, including Westminster Abbey, and there's another big Protestant church which name I've forgotten, but they had a bomb hole right in their floor, right into the basement, which was interesting. But the war was not over by any means, but we were advancing well in Germany, and the worst of the bombing happened before I was ever there. So I was there for about a year, and then thankfully peace came, as you know, in 1945, and we were slated to go to the Far East. And so we came back to the United States, and we were just ready to ship out. We were all prepared, packed up, ready to go to the Far East when they dropped those bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And so our hospital was dissolved, and I was given discharge in the fall of 1945. So my hometown church school didn't have a teacher yet, and they knew I was, school had started, but they knew I was going to come out, and I had a teaching experience. So they asked me if I would teach there in this one-room, 8th grade, 30-pupil school. So I said, yeah, I'll finish off the year there, which I did. And then in 1946, I moved with I had a wife by the time, and we moved to what was still Emmanuel Missionary College, which had 300 students. And I didn't yet have a degree, I just completed a elementary course for teachers, so I completed my degree here. And while I was here as a student, I organized an academy band and a grade school band. My father was a band director, 2 of my brothers were, and so it was probably in my blood. I just organized it. Anyway, when I graduated, they asked me if I would stay on as band director. They lost their band director for some reason or another, and here I was located and situated, so I said, sure, I'll stay, so I was put on the staff. And I might say in passing that at that time they had only 1 or 2 music students who were majoring in music. By the time I'd been here, maybe a decade or so, we were graduating as many as 30 at a time, with more than 100 music majors. They did build a new music building, but I had no input. I was, a pretty junior member of the faculty, and they made a big mistake in building the building. They made it out of cement block. And I went to the business manager and I said, cement is a good carrier of vibrations that music makes, and you really shouldn't use block. He said, hey, blocks are impervious to sounds. Anyway, we moved into the building, and you could hear a piano playing all over the building. So they tried to put sound reducing tiles on the walls, which deadened the rooms much more than they should have been, but anyway, we got along. Another incident I kind of remember, after we'd been there for several years, one of our teachers said, why don't we get a new curriculum here and update? And I said, well, okay, why don't you do that, Charlie? His name was Charles Davis. I said, Charles, you figure out what you'd like to change and why you want to change and why it would make it better and what would happen if we changed. I never heard from him again because he thought I would come up with something. But we had a good curriculum, it worked, we had a lot of students, so I changed it. But I said, Charlie, if you want to change it, let me know how and why and what might happen afterwards and why you want to change it. So, he was just one of the guys who talks. Activist, but don't know why he's acting or how to act. Well, it takes all kinds. We had about a dozen teachers in our family. We had a big music school. We had a dozen teachers, and they're all busy. And our building served us well, poorly, but anyway, it was a shelter in the time of a storm. And they named it after me after I retired. So, the connection gets pretty loose after a few years. You know how that goes. Of course, those who named it after me didn't know how inadequate the building was. But they've tried to adapt it best they can, and they've done a fairly decent job of insulating it where they can. And so it served pretty well. But I think they should really build soon a new building. And one of my physician's sons said, "I'm going to be sure to name it the Hamel Hall." I said, "Don't worry about that." So that's the way it is. After I graduated from college here, they used to put me out in what they call the field to recruit students. And you'd give you a list of people that you to call upon and their addresses. And I knocked on one door and I said, "Well, does so-and-so live here?" "Yes." "Well, we'd just like to have him come back to EMC to go to school." And the student came to the door. He said, "You know what? They just fired me last year." What do they call it? There's a certain word they use. Anyway, he was sent home. So that was a little embarrassing. But I did call on lots of students in Michigan and Illinois for several years. And I had one applicant who was very unhappy because he had applied long ago, he'd never heard. So when I came back to the office, here I was looking at the files, and here was this guy's file, and nothing had been done. He had heard nothing. And so I went to the president about that. So he said, "Well, why don't you stay here, Hamel? You can be director of admissions." So I had that. In those days, admissions was generally a summer proposition. You didn't recruit all year. So that was my job in the admissions office every summer for about 2 or 3 months. So that was an interesting little sidelight to my job in the music department. But how I got it was a big accident. And the president's daughter was one of our workers. But we vied for every student, which I guess they still do. That's what makes the university go round and round. And I don't think of too much else, actually. I did, when I was recruiting students in Chicago one summer, I kind of went AWOL and went to the hotels where the presidential candidates were gathering. And I got to shake hands with Eisenhower and his opponent, who was, forgotten his name, but he was from Ohio, and old Robert Taft. They were sort of vying to be the nominee of the Republican Party. And Eisenhower won. Anyway, I shook them both hands as they came in the hotel one time just to do it. And I said, "I'd like to wash his hand for a while," which I didn't. Because Eisenhower he's a good guy. Of course, he was our commanding officer overall during World War II. And I never met him during that time. He was, he had his own headquarters. But it was interesting that I could shake those hands. And I remember that very well. In fact, I met Horace Shaw there, and he said, "Paul, don't ever tell the president we're here. We're supposed to be working." Which I didn't. You can see I kept that very quiet. So I stayed on as a band director for probably a decade, and then our school grew, our department grew, and needed more teachers. So I was chairman. I was made chairman, and I gave up band directing to another teacher, and from then I was simply a teacher of music education and some history courses in music. I had a lot of outstanding students, but I've forgotten most of them. Probably when you have that many students, I enjoyed them. I would relate with them well while they were here, but when they were gone. But nowadays, even now, sometimes they'll stop in to see me, and they forget what an ordinary teacher I was. Hard-boiled.
Okay.
Although I was also kind, and I hope to be kind and considerate. But you have to make decisions sometimes, and if people don't perform well, you can't graduate. That's all. You can't have it. So that was my career here, and I retired when I was 62 years of age, and after 42 years of denominational appointments. because I had been employed in the denomination before the war, and the regulations required that war experience had to count as part of your longevity experience for the denomination. So I retired in when I was 62 years old. I mean, yeah, 60. No, sorry, when I had 62 years of experience teaching for this, and in the denominational employment. And I canvassed part of a year before that, so I had a busy time. Well, you know, an interesting thing is my wife, I mentioned, died in about 1989 or 88. And I've been going to Russia quite a bit, and I met quite a few Adventists in Russia, and I was sometimes apprehended at the customs, but sometimes I brought in quite a few Bibles to Russia, different times. While I was teaching here, I have a quarter off or summer off, and I made some good friends in the church, and I noticed a big change in how foreigners were treated in Russia. First of all, I'd go to the church and I just didn't bear to mix too well. Then later on, they'd say, "Why don't you write another year? They'd say, why don't you write a little message to the church and I'll read it?" And then later on, I was able to speak in the church. So things got a little looser while I was doing this. Anyway, I've been to Russia probably 6 or 8 times, and I took a lot of Bibles and a lot of literature. And one time I took my 3 sons, who were college students here. They was a bearded age, and they looked like hippies. I thought, man, we're going to have problems. But I had a lot of literature in my suitcases, and they didn't even open them up. And I gave them to the guy in the Adventist church in Moscow. He said, "How did you get these in here?" Yeah, he couldn't understand it. And I had a bunch of Bibles. He said, "We're going to have some efforts in somewhere in Russia. We can sure use these." Of course, that was the old Russian Bible. Some inaccuracies in it. It wasn't the best. They have a newer, as you know, a newer Bible now, better one. Anyway, one time I went to Russia, and I took a boat from Moscow to that was then called Leningrad, St. Petersburg. They have canals and rivers all the way. It was a boat ride. And on this boat, there were quite a few Adventists. I was with a group. I guess they're mostly Adventists. Anyway, I met on this group a lady about my age from Niles who was single, and she was a nurse anesthetist. And we got acquainted on this ship, and she lived in Niles. I'd never met her before. Anyway, we got interested in each other. I finally married her. So that was a plus. And they had what they called, they had a bureau for visitors. And when you landed in Russia, they took over. And they told you where you go, where you couldn't go, and they would have a group. You'd go with them by plane or by boat or by rail. And I did a lot of experience. In fact, I went across on the Trans-Siberian Railway one time from Moscow as far as you go. I think it's 7 time zones. But all the time and all the times and all the stations in Russia, the train stations, it's always Moscow time, not local time. But I was 7 different time zones going across. Then I flew back later on. So I had some interesting times in Russia. I made some good friends there. And in fact, I met a girl in Russia who finally came here to school. We helped her. We actually helped her financially, and she lived with us for a time. And she was a Jewish girl, but they let some Jews go now and then. I've forgotten how I met her. Maybe she was a guide at one time or something. But anyway, she's now living in California. She graduated from here and never became an Adventist. She's Jewish, but she's a nice lady. Her name was Dina Novak. And her father, I used to see her now and then when I would go to Russia, and her father says, "You want to be careful about Dina. Don't give her any influence about leaving Russia. If she leaves, I'll be in trouble." He was a big shot. In fact, he was a lawyer for the Russians at the Nuremberg trials when they tried the German hierarchy for war crimes. And he was one of the Russian, he was a lawyer. He was Jewish, but he was one of the lawyers. In fact, I've read something about the Nuremberg trials, and he's listed as one of the lawyers there. So he had a high position, but he was afraid of losing it if his daughter ever applied. She wanted to get out of Russia in the worst way. And I wanted to help her, but we found each other a little bit anyway. So that more or less resolved those situations. In the meantime, I have 5 sons, all of whom graduated here from this institution, Andrews University, and 2 of them are now medical doctors. Another one has a doctor's degree in business and does very well as a consultant in the business. So I had a good, interesting life, although my first wife passed away about 1980-something. And I remarried a couple years later. And anyway, I've had a good life, and I appreciate the guidance of the Lord and everything that happened.